Peaty kept pouring more alcohol in it every time until I couldn't stand anymore. And they're just laughing the whole time, and I can't even walk. Peaty was really difficult at the time. He had been a long-term Rockshox athlete, and he did not want to change. That year he won the world championship. We went through, I'd say 15 to 20 shock iterations internally trying to make him happy on that bike. You really got to hear the problems straightforward. And at that time, there were a lot of them. I've been riding garbage for so long, I don't know if I know what a good one would feel like.
Can both of those people still win a World Cup?
I don't think so.
Mark Fitzsimmons, welcome to the Downtime podcast, man. Thanks for taking some time out of your day to join us for a chat.
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me. I've been listening to them for a while. They're great road trip listenings, and so I'm a bit up to speed with most of the athletes you've been interviewing, so it's all good.
Excellent. Thanks, man. And let's start with a bit of background, right? It sounds from the research that I've done that like all bikes of all types have been a love of yours for a long, long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been riding two wheels since I started 2.5 years old, and did some BMX as a kid, got into motocross as a teenager while riding mountain bikes, literally back in the 80s. And really the passion hasn't stopped since. So I've gone from that to road racing, to motocross, to I do some off-road racing now, and still ride bikes 4 to 5 times a week if I can.
Good effort. And were you always the sort of person to be tinkering about with bikes and cars and stuff from a young age? Were you kind of inquisitive about how things work and how to improve them?
Oh man, yeah. It's been almost an addiction in a strange way, to where, as a kid having RC cars, even I wanted to always build them. I didn't want to buy them complete, and I even got paid in like junior high school to build some for kids just because I just loved it. Drove my parents nuts because I'd lay out all the parts on the table and in the kitchen and make a mess. But yeah, I can't stop getting my hands into things, and the curiosity always drove me to doing it.
Yeah. Was it a natural thing for you then to follow like a technical path with education?
Yeah, it was pretty easy. I always understood and had an eye for seeing how things worked. And if I couldn't, I needed to get in there and do it. All the way from the first time I got a job in the bike industry at Rockshox to where, they started making rear shocks at the time, right when I started, and no one wanted to touch them other than the engineer. And I thought, give that to me. I'll get in there and work on it. It's just oil and shims. And it somehow stuck at the time, and I became that guy just by default of wanting to touch them.
I want to understand a little bit about how you got to Rockshox, right? Because it wasn't a straight path from education to there. What was it you studied, and where did that lead you initially?
Yeah, I went to school for engineering, started becoming a career student. So I didn't get the degree. I got kicked out of the house by my parents before that happened, and got told to go get a job, stop screwing around. So I was actually working in the electronics industry for a company called Electro Engineering. They actually built transformers and power supplies for the government. And then part-time in the evenings, I worked for my friend's dad's shop, which was a welding and fab shop. So doing that for fun, and they actually had a motocross track in the backyard. So that was like our evening program of working and screwing around. So I wanted to work in the bike industry so bad, and I had a friend that works for Rockshox, and I would call him about every other day and sent my resume there. And once I got to the person that could hire me, I called them just about every day until they finally got tired of it and called me in for an interview.
Amazing. And was it an instant hire? Like, it wasn't straight into like a product role, right? I think into customer support kind of side of things. Yeah,
it was customer support. That was back in '96. And that lasted about, let's say, 8 to 9 months, to where once they realized how passionate, how much I was into the technical side of it, they started sending me to races. I probably 6 months into it. And then with the rear shock element to it, they needed someone to tune and work with the OE customers at the time. So they started bringing me in for that. And literally after about 4 months of that, Paul Turner, Mike McAndrews, who works over at Specialized now, and Mark Marquez called me over and said, "Do you want a full-time job in the product development?" They called it PDL at the time. And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't want to answer the phones anymore."
Insta360 are leaders in the world of 360-degree and action cameras, and they're seriously invested in mountain biking, backing a ton of top riders like G. Atherton and Matt Jones, as well as events like Hardline and Darkfest. Action cameras are a great tool, whether you're shooting POV footage, filming your mates, or using them at races to check lines, remember tracks, or even time your runs. Insta360 have got something for everyone, with a full range of 360 cameras, traditional action cameras, and the tiny thumb-sized Go series, plus a huge range of mounts and accessories to help you film however and wherever you ride. I've been putting in time on their Ace Pro 2, and honestly, it's impressed me. The image quality is incredible thanks to a lens developed in partnership with Leica, and the low light performance really stands out. Let's be honest, most of us are filming in the woods, so that's a big win. I had it mounted on Insta360's super easy to use chin mount, and with just the standard stabilization switched on, it gave me the best action cam footage I've ever captured, and it was the easiest to get set up too. With a built-in wind guard and smart audio processing, wind noise is a thing of the past. Battery life is great, the touchscreen is super responsive, and you can even flip it up if you fancy doing a bit of vlogging. It's simple, powerful, and a pleasure to use, and however you want to mount it, Insta360 have the accessories to make it happen. You can check out the entire range at insta360.com, and if you use the code Downtime at the checkout, you'll get a free helmet chin mount with any Ace Pro 2 or X5 purchase. That offer runs until the 30th of July 2025 and is limited to just 30 free chin mounts, so don't hang around. I guess that was a good grounding though, right? Because you're hearing everyone's problems. You're finding out what about the product doesn't work or is hard to work with or is going wrong. So there's a good baseline there from speaking to customers.
I thought it was awesome at the time. The way they had it is you worked in service 3 days a week and on the phones 2 days a week. So you really got to hear the problem straightforward. And at that time, there were a lot of them. And, you got to manage. So you manage that part. Learn some organizational skills and get out there and you actually had a little bit of a connection because you would see sometimes that guy you're talking to, his fork, that shock that came in. And I thought it really gelled well together. I think actually more companies should do it now still.
Yeah, definitely. It's not a bad idea, but that must have been a bit of a dream for you based on your interests and your tinkering with product to be finally in the product development team and then to be getting sent to races, I guess, to work alongside some of the biggest names in the sport at that point in time, right? Like Rockshox was a big deal, and it was making waves with bringing suspension products to the market.
Yeah. Back then it was, for me, it was kind of starstruck a little bit. You get sent to the races and it's like, oh, there's Sean Palmer and riders like that, and some of the top Olympians in cross country even. So it was, Tinker Juarez and those kind of guys, it was just a huge deal for me. It's like, oh, I'm actually talking to them, Ned Overend and those guys. So it was amazing for me at the time. And then, when you have that much, it's the word, probably passion for it and being starstruck, you'd pretty much do anything they would ask for. I didn't learn till later on the athlete management part of it, where don't always give them what they want. They might not know.
And like suspension, forks maybe had been around a little while at that point, I guess, but rear suspension was pretty new, like you alluded to, right? People were almost averse to this whole rear suspension thing. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And boy, was it a learning process. At that time, GT was one of the largest customers and had one of the biggest teams at the time between Eric Carter and Mike King and those guys. And tuning the suspension for bikes that had a degressive linkage curve and trying to valve them and how they were mounting them on trunnions in different ways. They could fail hydraulically, they would fail mechanically. It was pretty, you spent more time trying to make sure you're fixing things breaking rather than doing the tuning part, which is so much nicer now.
Yeah, product wasn't so robust back then, eh? Like a lot of stuff used to break, especially under racing strain.
Oh man, yeah. At one time, the Trunnion Rockshox Super Deluxe, the way it was mounted and the way that thing was designed, if a rider hit something hard enough, the whole top cap would just blow off the thing, and quite a loud bang. And trying to build confidence in the riders at that time, and fixing those issues was the delicate balance. Is trying to get them to be like, okay, it's not going to happen again, or I mean, sometimes it was actually scary.
Yeah, what was the priority? Is it trying to sort of keep the athlete away from the failure, almost so they don't know anything sketchy's going on, or are you also, I guess, trying to keep it out of the public eye, right? Like no one wants their product failing in public either.
Yeah. The guys actually that we worked with then were quite professional about it, so they didn't make a big deal out of it. They would come over. You always hoped it never cost them a race or an injury. That was the biggest thing. And you'd work through it with them. I took approach of practicing transparency with them. That was, this is why it happened. We think this is, we're working on this, as a thread pitch design, whatever it was that caused a failure or a seal, and hoping that they, at least by bringing them into what's happening in the process, it would smooth it out if there was an issue. Nothing was worse than, because the first thing that would happen, actually two things could happen. One is either way they could go tell their peers or the other riders, or speak to it. But you'd rather have them doing it in a trust mode than a complaint mode about not knowing and they just have these problems.
For sure. What is it about the failure rate back then that you think was driving it? I feel like we have a lower failure rate in racing now than we did then. Is it a fact that we were seeing more development done out in the open and done at racing then than maybe we are now? Is it a lack of understanding of the duress the parts were being put through, or is it just that we've got better at engineering these things now?
I think it was better engineering. There wasn't a lot of data collection at the time to even understand the forces that the bikes, the shocks were being put through, the forks. We were just learning. It was trial by racing and what was happening versus putting strain gauges on and accelerometers and actually learning what those forces were and having a larger data set of understanding. And the test labs were okay, but they were designed to meet ASTM standards and those kinds of things rather than what's happening at the highest level in racing. So I think all that's come together now, and that's really, really important because we can understand failure modes and what's happening subjectively and objectively through a test lab, through the data ACK. And now it's so much more mature. I'll use that word.
Stash space rails is the ultimate way to store your bikes. You can get more bikes into less space. It's really easy to fit, it's really easy to use, get to whatever bike you want exactly when you need it. Downtime viewers get 10% off their entire order by heading to stashproducts.co.uk/downtime and using the code downtime, all in capitals, at the checkout. Upgrade your bike storage today.
I guess then you play like a two-sided role in those areas, right? You're the technical lead for the product as far as the athlete's concerned, and you're helping advise them on that. But you've also got this personal connection where you're, like you said, trying to convince them that the product's safe and that they're going to be okay to go fast on it. It's quite a complex role to achieve.
Yeah, it is now, and it was then. You're playing, my role was quite different because it wasn't, most race in companies I worked for were racing companies. So it wasn't more of a marketing role, and racing wasn't marketing. It was a tool for marketing. The racing was a development and was the DNA of the company. So everything was tied into engineering and development. And and everyone cared so much and also was so competitive that it allowed us to handle those situations quite quickly, dealing with the riders. And me being communicator to the company and working through the riders, always had to thread the needle a little bit, trying to get things done quick enough for them, trying to make them stoked. And yeah, you do not want to see a rider injured or unhappy. I always, my philosophy was, our job is to give the rider performance advantage. And their job is to do the best they can and win races, and try to keep that relationship working that way, to where you don't make it too messy, even if they are one of your good friends. Over the years between Steve, Pete, and Minnaar, and those guys we've become great friends. But you have to really keep it professional when you're trying to give them the tools to do their job.
Yeah, okay, easy to cross the line in both directions, I guess. And I think it was your move to Fox where things like really got going and ramped up on the product tuning side of things. But like, first off, how did you end up moving from Rockshox to Fox?
Yeah, I moved to Colorado Springs with Rockshox, and during that time, we actually had to sign a 2-year commitment contract to be with them because they were going through lots of changes, and I hadn't known they were talking to SRAM, and SRAM was interested in buying them. And so I was involved in that process a little bit. And then, so I met my 2 years, and I grew up in the Bay Area, Santa Cruz, and I missed it so much back there at the time. So same guy that kind of moved me into product development was actually the manager at Fox in the bike division, Mike McAndrews. So we were talking, and I said I'd love to come back. And after a couple months of conversation, he found a role for me there. That was in 2002, and that role was test lab engineer. And so, but once I got there, they immediately explained their other plans. What they had in mind.
Came right from the top, right? Like, I think Bob Fox was involved in those plans, yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, it was, I went through, the normal interview process, and then literally I think it was the day after I started, Bob Fox came in, gave me a shoulder tap, took me into his office, and re-interviewed me after I'd been hired, pretty much. And he's quite a, if you ever look into his background, he's an interesting person. He was a professional poker player and card reader. So and if you knew that, you had to be very careful with his questions. And I had a hint of it. So, even from right when he sat me down, says, "So why are you here?" It's like, which trick question is this? And then he basically interrogated me, and it's a good conversation. And from there, he explained to me, we need guys like you. And at the time, I was riding at a pretty good level. So he immediately put me into being the test rider for the company internally. And then teed up, racing and how that was important to him and the company. The acid test. His old school philosophy was, we win on Sunday, we sell on Monday. And from there, he kind of handed me the reins, after about a year. It's just 2003. And I knew about the downhill fork they were working on, or it was a thought at the time. And he kind of just gave me an open book, and the budget was under engineering, so there was no marketing attached to it. And kind of took off from there. They had, at the time, the Luna team, Kyle Strait, who was like 14 years old, I believe, or 15, and Brian Lopes, and a couple local guys. And that was the extent of the race program. Nice trailer setup and one technician. working in the shop and at the races. And I just took it from there and started doing my thing and signing on riders and Yeti team and Sam Hill at the time for rear shocks. And yeah, it just literally took off. And because I felt lucky, he had enough confidence and trust in me, and the company did. They really never questioned it or really wasn't discussion. It was more of when I'd come to him about a budget or a team or a rider, he kind of had me 3 questions he'd ask me. He's like, well, we're going to win races. Are we going to make better product? Are we going to sell more product from it? If the answer was yes, he'd be like, that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, that's amazing. And getting that Yeti team on board was a big deal, right? That team was stacked at that point in time.
Yeah, it was huge. That was a big deal for the company. You know, we actually owe them a big thank you for that from that time frame because they took a big risk. They were a Manitou sponsored team, and not knowing anything about the downhill forks, that was really big. And they just signed Jared Graves, who was told he shouldn't ride a bike ever again at the time for one of his injuries. And then, yeah, they put on Justin Leov, had Sam Blinkensop at the time. And then they had the B team, which Aaron came in after a little bit later with that. And then they had an RPM team, which is their Colorado team. So we had a great data set at the time, and that team was just amazing for us. And first downhill fork testing, it was a bit nerve-wracking having riders at that level testing a new fork. And holy moly, the problems that we would deal with were amazing of learning, down from titanium springs breaking, just random stuff. But that team stood behind us, all the way till I think now with Fox, which is amazing.
Yeah, it's a long-term partnership. What was the response like from the athletes initially? Because, like you said, they've been with Manitou, they've been used to winning, I guess. Like there was a lot of top people on that roster, and they're coming to a brand at that point that's just finding its feet with the downhill fork, like you say. Was it a piece of work to kind of earn their trust?
Oh yeah, it was very, very much so. When they first saw the 40 fork, it's like, holy crap, that thing's big. It looks heavy. And, they were quite skeptical. I remember Jared Graves, coming from Rockshox, going just being more nervous than anything. But I knew it was my job to develop that trust with them. Without ever meeting him, I picked him up in Las Vegas at the airport, straight from Australia. Met with the other riders, and we started off by having dinner and just spending some time together, trying to get to know each other, letting them get to know the product, explaining it to them. And that's kind of when the test process started too. A lot of these teams and riders didn't have a lot of pre-season testing actually with companies. It was, in some ways, it was more of a formality than a real test session. Yeah, we went straight to testing with those guys at Bootleg Canyon near Las Vegas. Not the greatest place. There's nothing like it in World Cups, but we knew the guy that ran the park, and it was easy. It was in the winter, so it was fairly warm. And we literally, I put them to work, and I remember actually having them take notes and kind of having that interaction. And Sam Blinkensop, it was confusing to him at the time, almost. It was like, I just want to ride my bike, mate. And well, I'm going to compare this a little bit to a photo shoot. It's going to be a lot of repetition. We're going to do a lot of repetition. And it's going to be over and over kind of dissecting stuff. And it won't seem fun in the beginning, but if it helps you with your riding and your racing, you're going to want to do it a lot.
Yeah. Are riders coming into the system now like more prepared for that side of things? Like pre-season testing is a much bigger program than it ever has been, I think, probably. And it sounds like, you know, what you guys were doing at Fox then was a big part of laying the foundation of that. Are riders more familiar and more able, or is it still varying from rider to rider?
It varies from rider to rider. I think the new kids coming into it are so fast and already so educated on it now from watching it and seeing it, that it's not so much new, but actually putting them to work in that style is still, I think every time is almost like Groundhog Day in a weird way when you have the teenagers coming in to where you got to explain, you got to teach them. And for some, they don't want anything to do with it. You know, they just want to ride, go as fast as they can, make my bike fast, kind of thing. And others really get in, they want to get into the weeds. They love it. They love the process. Those are my favorite to work with, because when they really enjoyed that and wanted to understand, it made it great on both sides.
Do you think you can be a successful athlete these days taking either of those two routes? The like, I just want to ride fast, you set it up, I'm not too interested, versus the kind of really process driven, focused athletes that will work alongside you and be scribbling down notes? Like, can both of those people still win a World Cup?
I don't think so. You know, to be honest, there probably not now at the highest level. You know, my last experience with working at TRP with one rider, he is very specific to what he needed, and liked to communicate what he needed and was unique to him and was fast as can be. But for some reason, he couldn't seem to put two together to, to be consistent. I mean, he almost won a world championship a few years back, but man, it was tricky. And you know, they're still kids, and their patience are minimal. So that's the tricky part, because they want an instant result. They want you to fix it for them. So yeah, to answer your question, make it short, I don't think it could be one or the other. I think it has to be developed as both.
And I guess those pre-season sessions are good for, like, not only for putting hours on the product and on the bike and getting familiar and getting dialed in and base settings and all that good stuff, but you're together, you're spending time together, and you're spending time together away from races and even away from bikes, right? You have evenings together and that social side, which builds the trust, builds the rapport, and I guess improves the working relationship as well. I would assume that's also quite an important part of it.
Yeah, it's very critical for and not only for their team, but for the technicians, mechanics. I think it's super important. And, it's a working relationship, and it's no different working in the office with your peers. If you guys don't know each other outside of work, it's hard to get along and deal through the hard times when you're in the workplace. So you have to be able to develop that. And I think it's the same with the riders, because it doesn't always go perfect. They've got bad days, and they're pissed. So they and you have to manage that with them. So it's that working relationship is really, really important, because if it's not going right, they still have to trust you.
Yeah, 100%. And you brought on a team that's, I guess, known for its social side with the Santa Cruz Syndicate. Was that an easy decision to get that crew on board?
Yeah, it was actually quite hard. It was, Greg wasn't too hard. Peaty was really difficult at the time. He had been a long-term Rockshox athlete, and that was, I think that's how he wanted his career to continue. And he did not want to change, and which is understandable. But I knew him from before that with some testing and rear shock stuff. And, I had to explain to him our job's to give you performance advantage. So if we can focus on that we're going to try to give you the best you can so you can continue going forward. And he listened, and time still went by, and Rob Roskop had to help do some convincing there, and it took a while. And plus, he had to communicate to Rockshox, which he has such a great relationship with, that he was making this huge change. It's probably really hard for him. So yeah, and Bryceland was easy.
Bryson seems like the sort of person that's been pretty relaxed about a lot of stuff, especially at that age, right?
Yeah, he was awesome. He was awesome to work with. When something wasn't right, it was hard for him at the time, to explain what it was. He just knew it didn't feel right, and he was frustrated. But he's so easygoing, could still work through it with him. But that year he won the world championship. We went through, I'd say 15 to 20 shock iterations internally, trying to make him happy on that bike in that setup. I kept a spreadsheet actually of all the valve codes we did for him, because that year was really tricky.
Yeah, because a lot of people would assume that Josh was like a run what you brung kind of guy, like just turn up on a setting that he felt vaguely comfortable on and just work out how to make the bike work on that track. But maybe behind the curtain, that wasn't quite the case.
No, it wasn't. And that was when we really started stepping it up at the time with Data Ac on the bikes. We signed that team, and we went in still late winter. We went down to Italy, or flew to Italy, and they all came in, and we spent almost a week testing. And at the time, I had contracted an engineer that was at Data Ac experience. He was actually from IndyCar racing, and but he was a bike guy. And so we had to use that data with those guys at that time. And that was a big component, especially for Josh and Greg. It was easy because he loves it. Actually Cedric was on the team, kind of halfway on the team at the time, Cedric Gracia. So we had all four of those guys, and we're doing Data Ac on the bikes. We were pairing the Data Ac to 3-lap system and segments. So once they understood we were doing our job to give them an advantage and get their bikes right, it was it went well. But yeah, Josh wasn't he was easygoing, but when it wasn't right, he didn't know what it needed to be right. So we were using our tools to help him with that.
Do you remember what it was for Josh that unlocked that performance? What did you ultimately change on the shock that got him comfortable?
Yeah, it had to do with the balance of the bike. And that particular year, if you remember, but he was losing the front end quite a bit. And he'd be on, it'd be green, and then boom, he'd hit the ground. And that bike at the time had a really interesting linkage curve in the back. And the shock at the time, which was a boost valve shock, had interesting damping characteristics, and they really didn't match each other, not even the slightest. That back end would blow straight through the travel. It's very high leveraged at that time, and I took on getting a bike myself and riding it in the background, and Greg would come out and we'd do some testing on the local mountain. And I really, we took it from 8 inches 10 to 8 inches, because that bike they were running it the past 2 years at 10 inches, like 2011-ish. And I didn't think it was working correctly for the front and the balance. It was unloading the front, it was washing out. So I actually took the boost valve out of that shock for Josh and went through a whole bunch of valving, different iterations of valving for compression, trying to get it hold up in the right areas to match that linkage curve, and getting him to where he wanted to be able to push through it so hard and still do what he was doing. He's going so fast at that time. that it just needed to be balanced. And back to that kind of rider do both now, he wanted to switch his brain off, which is what he was so good at doing. So we got him there, and he won that title. He won the title. But yeah, we went through a lot of shock iterations. He didn't see it in the background. A lot of them don't. You do the work, and you show up with maybe three different valvings, and let them try it and what works best, and you keep working on it. I took that one on myself that year because the team is the biggest budget we ever spent on a team, the highest level of riders. I convinced the company to do the whole thing. And I wanted to see him do well. So I really held that one on my shoulders for those first 2 years because it was a big responsibility.
Yeah, fair. So can a good shock tune mask a bad linkage? Like, do you think that's feasible? It sounds like that's kind of where you ended up with in that instance.
Yeah, not anymore. You could back then a little bit, but they really need to work together. And that is one interesting thing in the bike industry that's so radically different from the motorcycle industry and motocross. You look at linkage curves on dirt bikes, they're all super close. They almost all do the same exact thing within a couple of percentages. And it just blows me away on a bicycle how one could be a flat rate, which there aren't too many anymore that are like that. But one could be 10% rising and one could be 50% rising, all to do the same thing at the same level of riders. That's always been a struggle for me to get my head around in the industry. And valving to those and getting you can't mask it. You can just match the rider's technique.
And how was it trying to keep up with the Syndicate off the track then? I guess you had to learn to work hard and play hard with that gang, especially at that point in time.
Oh man, yeah, it was. We had some fun, that's for sure. We missed some flights, and because we couldn't get up in the morning. Yeah, I mean, Rob was very invested. Rockshox at the time, so he was coming to those test sessions and those out of race testing and ride events. It was awesome, but holy moly, it was a handful for a while. And I remember one night we were out to dinner. Somehow every time I went to grab my drink, it was full, and by the time I was so drunk, I didn't even realize Peaty kept pouring more alcohol in it every time until I couldn't stand anymore. And they're just laughing the whole time, and I can't even walk.
Amazing. Fun times. And am I right in thinking it was you that hired Geordie into the role at Fox?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe he was working for a couple riders at Specialized at the time. And he lived in Santa Cruz, and Geordie and I have an interesting background. We're almost exactly the same age. And he grew up in the East Bay, and I grew up in the East Bay of California. We actually were at races together without knowing each other in the early 90s.
Right.
Sometimes racing against each other. So I knew him through that, and we needed a new technician, and I approached him, and I knew he was quite technical. He likes to get into the weeds and work on stuff himself, and brought him on board, and it was all history after that.
Yeah. Do you find it strange that Geordie's kind of become famous off the back of doing that role now, like with the whole Dialed series the last few years, and like the exposure through team videos and stuff as well? Like, he's become like a bit of a celebrity now.
Yeah, he sure has, and which is great because that my last year at Fox is when the Dialed series started, and I was into it, but I was also quite resistant to having cameras and the marketing element. And I actually remember having some of the riders that year come to me and say, I don't want that camera around me, and I don't want them listening to what I'm talking about with my settings. It was a big deal. And Geordie has a charisma. He's quite good at it. So it worked out quite well for him. and he doesn't mind being in front of the camera, which is great. And it does create probably an issue. It did then. I don't know if it does now, to where, people, the new riders come in and they want to talk to Jordy because he's the guy. And there's a lot of other amazing technicians that can help them, but they want to talk to Jordy because they think he's the guy that can fix it. And he is.
Yeah, he's definitely got that reputation. I think he still gets a lot of DMs on social media from people all around the world wanting help with a suspension setup. So yeah, he's definitely put himself in that position, I guess, through that fame. But yeah, what have you been up to since you left Fox then? Because it's been a few years now, right?
Yeah. I went to TRP for about 2.5 years after that in Tektro. I thought it was be an interesting transition. I'd done suspension for so long, but it's still oil going through holes and hydraulics. And I wanted a new challenge. And they were actually, the brakes and having Aaron, they were looking to grow sports marketing side of racing and more OE opportunities. So I actually worked with Lance, who runs TRP now. I worked back with him in 1998 at Rockshox, I think it was. He was a sales manager. Okay. So we had a conversation, and they hired me as business development director, and to help get the TRP specific side going more and more, which was a nice challenge. And then after, half a year or so, they asked me if I wanted to head up the racing part, sports marketing globally. So I did that, signed the Common Sol team to them, and with the drivetrain. And in all honesty, it was almost like starting back in the early days with the 40 fork, because it's new. Lots of problems can happen. You're learning quickly. The riders are used to what they're used to, and so yeah, that was a nice turn and change. And those guys are still growing. They got hit with the COVID problem like everybody else. So I think a lot of times things get stalled out. That's what's happening a bit. But I left there about a year ago, and been doing a little consulting since then.
Nice, good stuff. And you've clearly learned a lot through your days in like tuning, testing, sports marketing, working alongside athletes, and you've been sharing some of that wisdom recently in a little LinkedIn pro tip series. And I wanted to pick up on some of those, I think, 'cause it's been super interesting for me reading those. And I think there's some stuff we could dig into that will be useful to the audience. First off, though, I couldn't find tip number 1 for some reason. It seems to have disappeared. Can you remember what it was?
Now that you're asking at this exact moment, I can't. I've got them all in my notes. I definitely know exactly what it is and where it's at, but I don't remember which was tip number 1.
Okay, well, we'll go in at tip number 2 in that case then, which was around bikes in winter. And I think you used the phrase that they can feel like wood, which is definitely the case. What advice do you have for bikes in wintertime?
Yeah, I did. Well, rubber being having a durometer, it definitely changes with temperature. So it could be your seals, tires, whatever it is. And a lot of our testing with World Cup riders was in the winter, and sometimes it was 0 degrees at the top of the mountain when we were starting. And that term wood came from the riders, to where could have been Mark Beaumont, could have been one of them that was saying it at the time. And they're like, I just have no feel with what's going on here. And, interesting sidebar to that is you're doing suspension specific testing, but you're having to manage other parts of the bike. It's like, well, I can't change that the tires feel like wood. You can't fix that part, but we just have to understand it and know that that's a component to the whole thing. So yeah, lower tire pressure, softer durometer could help. We go through those variables, and then with the suspension, the oil, obviously it's thick, it's cold, gets hot. It's still a big problem in racing because it starts at a temperature and it can change from top to bottom quite a bit. So I think the biggest thing is understanding that it's different. You can make very minute changes in the winter to deal with that, whether it's lowering pressures a little bit, couple psi, opening rebound, compression, probably rebound more than compression. Trying to get things to just loosen up a bit. And then just know it's going to change again, and you definitely write down those settings, because once it warms up, it's going to feel, you're not going to like it.
Yeah, for sure. And number 2 then was know your bike, with a quote, I think, from a world-class athlete, that the best bike setup is the bike that you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good one, because so many riders come from different backgrounds, whether it's BMX, and at that time, some were slalom, some were crossing over downhill, and understanding your personal preference and then pairing that to the bike, and some of those came from learning with Steve Peat, actually. I remember one time when I started working with Steve Peat, he said, he goes, "Mate, I've been riding garbage for so long, I don't know if I know what a good one would feel like." He goes, and I remember saying, "I've just learned to ride around the problem," which should be taught to every rider at some point. Is learn to ride around the problem, because sometimes you can't correct it, especially in the World Cup weekend. It's so short. So yeah, getting to know your bike, and that bike is making lots of changes could send you sideways. So that's so key in my mind, is like, know your bike, know it well. Maybe it's not perfect, but you're going to understand the changes if you do.
That nicely leads on to number 4, actually, which is something I really like the sound of, and that's the 3 times rule. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, the 3 times rule. That came, 3 times rule is really important with 29ers, when 29ers came into play. Because, every rider got on one that was at that level, just absolutely hated it, because it changed their braking points, it changed their turn-in points. They all said it was slower, even though on the clock it was faster. And then so the 3 times was the second time, they'd start to get used to it a little bit and be like, okay, I'm starting to gel. And then third time, they could usually start to pick out those little problems after the third time. Be like, oh, I do recognize I have to brake differently and do these things. And I think it applies to so many things, that 3 times. So just give it a shot, keep an open mind, and have the patience for it. That's the big one. Don't expect that immediate fix. And it doesn't matter what it is, whatever part you put on your bike, from a handlebar to a new tire, you got to give it, I believe you got to give it 3 times if you have that time to allow it. It definitely makes a big difference. And sometimes, if it's from a technician side, I'll say the 3 times is important, because the rider might not like it, but you already have proved out it's an advantage. So what you need to do is get them used to it enough to it becomes their new norm.
And is that 3 times like three runs on the same track, or 3 completely separate rides? Or how are you looking at that 3 times rule?
Yeah, that 3 times rule, same track. I'm a big believer in reducing variables in order to get the data and for it to be accurate. So yeah, you wouldn't want to change a thing, which is very hard with riders to get them to do the exact same thing 3 times in a row. Not that they can't do it, they just don't want to.
Yeah, fair enough. Not exciting, but useful, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I remember one time Jared Graves threw off our entire test session at Whistler Mountain because he got tired of riding the same trail, and he took the entire other riders that weren't even on the team to some other downhill course. we had data on the bike. We download the data. We look at it, and we're confused what the data's saying. We asked him, how's it going? He's quiet. He doesn't say a word. All the other riders are quiet. What's going on, guys? Well, we rode over here on the other mountain.
Amazing.
Our data AC engineer actually walked off and said, almost quit that day.
Amazing. Let's move on to number 5. Tune your suspension to your strength and style. And I think you have a good example here with Brian Lopes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's he's the great example. He came from BMX for cross, strong as an ox, and I remember very clearly on Whistler for their DH downhill. Everyone was riding downhill bikes at the time, and he came to do that race, and he came over and it's like, I really don't think I need 8 inches of travel on my bike. In my head, I was like, everyone's running 8 inches of travel. That's what you do. And I asked him why. He's like, well, I can suck it all up with my legs, and I think it's going to be slower. It's like, you do. And as I looked at his background, I'm like, oh, this makes complete sense. He likes to pump. He likes to use his body to work the bike, which I actually think was a transition of style in DH in that time frame too of riding. So it was quite difficult to do because we didn't have spring rods that were just 6 inches of travel. So we had to do some modifications for him at the time and get the back right too, and shorten the shock or stroke in the shock, and try to not mess with the ride height too much as well to meet that for him. And we gave him 6 inches of travel on his GT, and I'm almost positive he won that race that year. And then what they call the other one, the Garbanzo DH, I think he cleaned up on that one too.
Yeah, how would you say that that rule applies to a regular rider, someone who isn't Brian Lopes? Like, how would a normal person interpret that?
Yeah, really good question. I will use the example, and I think recently you had Sam Blinkensop on, if I remember correctly. And I was listening to when he was on the LaPierre team with Nicholas Vio, and Sam probably doesn't even know this at the time. And I think he mentioned something about Nicholas Vio being a bit cold or not helping with him. And what he probably did not know is Nicholas Vio was being a student of him and his riding style at that time. Because I remember, we went to a test. We tested with those guys, might have been Leo Gang potentially, at the same time. And Nicholas Vio was so confused by Sam compressing the bike and skipping over 20 feet of trail, and then doing it again, because his style was always wheels on the ground, traction control, making sure those wheels are constantly tracking. And that was his style. And Sam's style was like pumping and airing that bike through stuff. And he was going quite a bit faster. So I think those are two nice extreme examples. And Nicholas Vio was quite confused, but learning. He was using Sam he was being a student to Sam's riding style because he only had a couple more years of wanting to stay in the game and progress. And I think that was quite a big change. And tuning, that was a different change at how you actually tune the bike and the suspension. So that's an example of two different riders having two different styles. And Sam didn't know his style at the time. I think he was 19 or something. He just knew he's fast as can be. And Nicholas Vio certainly knew his style. So understanding it, knowing it, being able to tune to it. Aaron Gwynn was a good example, as after a couple of years, he really understood his style of wanting to use the bike to generate speed. And I think that was a paramount change a little bit. I think about it of using the bike to generate the speed. Where before they were riding the bike down and trying to use tires and suspension for traction.
Yeah, Aaron definitely brought something different, hey?
Yeah, he sure did. I mean, he was sensitive at the time. He could feel when the bike was slower and he wasn't getting pushback from the suspension in the bike into sections while he was going through. And at the same time, I remember him saying to me, "Don't worry about the small stuff. Just set up the bike so I can jump as far as I can, and it's going to take it." And he changed after a while. A few years later, he kind of adapted style a bit. But I remember at the time going, "You don't care about the traction and the small stuff." And say, "No, I'll deal with that. Just set it up so I can hit stuff as hard as I can." And at the time, it worked for him.
Yeah, it did for sure. All right, we'll move on to number 6, which is to find your base setting again and to write it down, which is super important, right? If people don't have a base setting for their bike somewhere, like I keep mine in the notes app on my phone so that I've always got that with me. So if I make any changes ever, I can go and update or scribble in what I've done and why I've done it. But yeah, that base setting and having it written down is really important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It needs to be your go-to. It kind of needs to be your warm blanket at home that you always grab. It's because it's easy to get lost. Different downhill racing, mountain biking, to me, is one of the hardest sports there is when it comes to two wheels, because your conditions change so much from place to place, completely different than motocross, anything like that. Harder, in my opinion, because of how the bike works in different conditions, from mud to dry and roots to whatever it is. You could get lost super easy. So having that base setting, you need to be able to go back. Always be able to go back. This is my home. I need to start there. And even in a given weekend of a race, World Cup weekend, after a couple of runs, course changes, rider gets a little might get a little, I'll use frustrated because it's not working how I want it to. It's like, let's go back. And sometimes we've had to do that right before riders, finals run. If they were like top 5 qualifier, I don't like how it's working in morning practice. Got 2 choices. We're going to have to ride around the problem. Your run's in 1 hour, or we go back to your base setting that because that's the bike you know how it works. If anything, it's going to give them the confidence.
Definitely. And confidence is a good thing when you're riding bikes. Number 7 then is, I think, a no-brainer for anyone with an engineering background, but not necessarily a no-brainer for everyone. Reduce the variables one change at a time.
Yes, the variables. That's it. I'm a big one with that. I've had arguments with riders. I've had them yell at me, and I've had to yell back at them. Where we go to a test session, we're doing testing, they want to change their handlebar height. They're trying to condense their time too, or even their position on the handlebar. And absolutely not. They'd be, "Well, I'm going to do it." I'm like, "Well, then we're done for the day." Because, you really have to eliminate those variables and focus on that one thing, which is tedious, takes a long time, it's boring, it's long form. But if you really want it, I always go back to, if you really want it, got to put the work in.
That is 100% true. Yeah, and it's not easy. It does take time for sure. And here's another one that takes up time and people probably won't do. But number 9 on the list was bracket on your next ride, which is a really interesting thing to go and do. And I think it's a really good way to tune in to what those adjusters on your bike actually do and get an understanding of that feeling. What's your advice on where to start and how to approach bracketing?
It's quite a simple thing to do, but it's also scary to tell a rider, shut your rebound down and do a run, and come back, close your compression and do a run. Bob Fox actually taught me it back in the early days when he'd come over and I'd tell him we're struggling with the rider, and he'd be like, got to bracket them. And I didn't even know what that meant at the time. And he explained to me, he's like, yeah, so do the extremes, but one by one, don't do them all. And then take that open rebound all the way, have them do a run, close it, have them do a run, and they're both going to suck, but they're going to gravitate towards one or the other. Be like, I kind of like that actually, but it wasn't right. And then that kind of takes your scale, when you got a scale. And I remember some of the riders going, that's shit to shit settings. I said, absolutely. But you're going to like one, you're going to end up somewhere here, and then we can hone you in from there. And that's also to teach them the feel, because you're also trying to teach them feeling sometimes in the testing and what to feel. And I had to do it quite a few times because some riders are so fast and they ride with their brain turned off. They had no idea. They just knew they didn't like it, and they'd be frustrated. And you got to kind of train them and help them along.
Yeah, that ability to feed back is so important for a rider, for an athlete, for sure. I guess it's also important if you're like committed enough to your riding that you pay someone to go and do a day-to-day or a setup day, like trying to get better at telling people what the bike's doing is even more important, right? To get some value out of that session. Do you have much advice around that and the language to use and how to think about communicating in those situations?
Yeah, that's sometimes a hard one, because riders have so much self-confidence and self-belief, and at that high level that they often, they know more than you always. And that's okay that they have that mentality. But I've had to explain to them, especially when they come down and go, I need my spring rate stiffer, or I need more compression. I would have to have, and if we didn't have that trust and know each other through test sessions, which was a lot of riders, they'd go, okay, I need you to explain to me what it's doing that you don't like in the condition. And we will do our job as experts to make the correct adjustments. And if we knew each other a little better, I'd go, hey, look, I'm not going to tell you how to ride your bike because I'm not you and I'm not as fast. And we don't want you to tell us what to do with the suspension. So we're going to marry the two together and we're going to make it work. So that's kind of my advice, is focus on the condition of what it's doing, and try not to focus on it as a negative as much as what you want it to be, what you want it to do better. Where it's like, I'd really like it to turn in a little earlier, or, that could apply to brakes, that could apply to everything on the bike. Explain to the mechanic or technician the condition, what it's doing, and let them do their job. But they have to be good at their job too in order to do that.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of feeling in it and a lot of emotion in it and a lot of different verbiage as well, different words get used. It must be quite hard. Like, I wonder if there's value in making more clarity around some of the words that we should use in these situations.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that. Even from a technician explaining back to the rider on both sides. One time I remember observing one of the technicians that worked for me and Mark Beaumont getting into an argument because he frequently used the word patter. It's pattering. And that technician at the time laughed. He's like, I don't know what that means, kind of thing. And and Mark came back. He's like, it's pattering through the braking bumps, kind of thing. And he said, the bike skipping around, and I was in the background just observing the situation that was happening. And I remember him getting so mad at the technician for laughing, because he didn't know what it meant, and he should have taken him seriously and tried to work through it. I mean, that's just a bad formula with what's happening there. So yeah, there's so many examples from that. Of that. One time Minnaar said to me at a test session, there's too much traction on the front end.
That seems like an odd thing to say.
Sounds like the greatest thing a rider could ever have. But what he meant was it was actually compressing too much on the front end on the couple of corners that were really sharp coming into hard, that were steep, and coming out of is getting too much compression into the front end, and it was knife turning in on him. And so it was grabbing the front end. So it took lots of back and forth of questioning for me to understand that, what too much traction meant. So to what you're saying, I absolutely agree. There could be a terminology language taught between the two. I mean, it exists already. I think it's something, it could be another level for the industry to mature in the racing side. Definitely. I mean, I don't think I've ever heard a rider describe, there's usually 3 parts to a corner, entry 1, 2, and 3, 2 being the middle, 3 being the exit, and trying to describe how a bike's working through braking, turn in, what's happening in section 2 of the corner, what's happening on the exit. All this can be taught, and I think it could really take it to another level.
Yeah, definitely some room for progression there. And I want to move on a little bit in your top tips. You focused a little bit on sponsorship, which I think is really interesting. And obviously you have that experience, through bringing athletes into programs. Number 11 was how to get sponsored and keep it. And I think you pulled out Nico Mullally and Tracy Mosley as good examples there. What was it that made them stand out for you?
Yeah, they're I would say their ability to connect. That was one of the main things. I met Nico Mullally when he was 16 on the side of a slalom course down in Santa Barbara near there. He was introduced, as just a kid. I don't even think he was in his riding gear. And I remember him looking at me straight in the eye, saying hello, shaking my hand, hanging out for a bit and just talking. And the interesting thing is I remember it very clearly, and he does too, to this day. Do you remember when we first met? Oh yeah, absolutely. Remembers who was with us. But he's got a great memory anyway, so it's he's good that way. Tracy Mosley, very professional, very, look you in the eye, say hello, shake your hand. Rather than, I think it goes a long way and just in the beginning, just being able to be present. The other important part is they didn't talk themselves up at all. They didn't. They could have been a professional basketball player or anything. They were just being a human and being able to speak that way. So that was a big deal. And Greg Minnaar's perfect at it. It's textbook on professionalism that way. And I think emulating those riders would be in their style of that could help so many.
And they're the sort of people that are there at the end of the weekend as well, helping take the pits down, saying thank you to everyone that's helped them out over the weekend. Like, it goes beyond just taking some product and going racing it fast, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And for us, in the early days, we were a small team and tearing down. Sometimes we'd have a media event there too. And then those riders would offer to hang out with the media. They also saw the benefit of that, but also it was a huge help. They did it. Can I take them for a ride, the media, whoever it is, a distributor, a VIP person. So just those little things would go such a long way because it's so much more than the racing. I mean, heck, a rider could be injured all year long and have no results. And those extra little things that they can do keep them in the limelight. It's a really big deal. So yeah, there's a lot to that. You could write a book about it, I think.
Will there be more pro tips coming? Are you planning on dropping any more wisdom on LinkedIn?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very careful about them because I know I'm talking to a broad audience with that. So it's so easy to go straight to those tips on the World Cup guys or that level kind of thing, and keeping it broad is actually is practice for myself, and in that aspect. So yeah, there's going to be more coming for sure.
Good stuff. I'll be keeping an eye on that. I've got a few more questions before we wrap up, though. And firstly, I wondered if you could only ever offer one piece of suspension advice that you had to give to everyone who asked you from now onwards, what would you give that you think would be relevant for a good percentage of people out there?
Practice on getting the balance of your bike correct between front and rear. It's easy. It's hard on the background of that. How to get to that balance, but that's the one piece I would give them, because the balance right on these new bikes, they're all so good. You don't have to do too much else.
Do you have any advice for how to get there? Like you said, I know it's complicated, but I've used balance data in data acquisition systems before, and I found that's really useful. I find it a lot harder to feel it. I know when it's good, but I'm not sure that I can like feel how to get there, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Starting with sag, and I know that one gets beat to death, and some people, they even say, it's not that important, to measure it. Because I like constants within that stuff, get your sag right. Start there and check it every few weeks even. And it's incredible how it will creep, especially in the back between temperature, a couple PSI, sag's going to change now. So that's the most important, is making sure those numbers are always the same. And then ride your buddy's bike. I think I might have touched on that one before. Ride someone else's bike. All of a sudden you might realize that front end feels good. And it might be because it's softer and your balance is more over the front, or it could be the bias the other way on the back. You pick up on those little things to figure out your balance. And you got this light machine below you, this bicycle that's so light that traction on both wheels is so important to get the grip and to do what it does. So it's kind of understanding that, because there's no other racing two-wheel machine that you can move a couple of millimeters and it's going to change everything about what that bike does in both directions, which is tricky, because back to the ride around the problem, you can lean back 2 millimeters to fix something or move forward 2 millimeters. It all makes such a difference on the bicycle, but just making sure your sag's right and experiment a little bit. I always say the 30% in the back. I've ridden bikes where it did not work properly until the sag was 20%. Because that back end needed to be higher, or bottom bracket was too low, kind of thing. So I think that's, experiment a little bit with those pressures.
Can you describe what a balanced bike would feel like to ride?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When you drop into a corner, and I'm going to call it a flat corner, drop into a flat corner, and you're loading your pedal, trying to get that thing to grip around the corner in loose conditions. You want that bike to probably not slide in the front or the rear. So your position's right, the bike's set up correctly, all constants are the same. The bike's going to just go around that corner so nice. And if it drifts, it's going to drift probably evenly through that corner versus the front going away or the back stepping out. And that's going to be a really balanced bike, that if you can make that happen. And it's a fun thing to do too, because you can move your weight forward and back, and you can see how difference it makes. So it's important to keep it right in the same spot. but a balanced bike feels phenomenal. And the new bikes are so great now that we have got longer wheelbases, and it's hard to outride a bike now.
Yeah, geometry is on our side for sure, which is a good place to be. And then one more before we hit our final 4 questions. And I'm wondering what advice you'd give for people wanting to find their way into the mountain bike industry. You've done a good chunk of different roles throughout the years, and you've got a lot of experience. What advice would you give people that are coming in afresh?
If you're just coming in or trying to get in, be persistent. Be persistent. Get yourself in there. Don't worry about what role is. Throw your ego out the door, and don't be afraid to roll up the sleeves. Get dirty. You gotta. Sometimes you gotta scrub the floor before you can design a shock.
Fair play. And it sounds like you've worked your way across many different roles to have the experiences you have, which have obviously paid off and given you an interesting and exciting career. We should start wrapping up. We'll ask our final 4 questions that we've asked most people throughout the years. The first of those, if our listeners had £150, which is a couple of $100, depending on what Donald Trump's been up to in the last few hours anyway, to improve their performance on a bike, what would you recommend they go spend it on?
Oh man, it's harder than it sounds. Good tires.
And is there a favored tire for you? Is there a tire you stick on most of your bikes?
Yeah, I think I follow probably the norm on that one, where it just cannot go wrong with a Maxxis Median for the most part. Yeah, it's like having it's most, you know what it does. It's reliable. Yeah, it can't go wrong.
Fair play. Yeah, definitely a lot of people using them. All right, second one, if you could wind back the clock and sit down with yourself age 16, what advice would you give 16-year-old Mark?
Have more patience.
Has that got better as you've got older?
Yes, absolutely. Even working throughout the office over the years, if I look back even from those early days, sometimes if I look back at myself and go, you sure weren't very nice, but it wasn't that I wasn't very nice. I just didn't have the patience.
Yeah, I feel pretty similarly on that one. All right, third one. If you could have a coaching session with anyone, past or present, and I'm sure you've had the opportunity to ride with a lot of great people throughout the years, who would it be, and what would you want to learn from them?
Do you want it to be specific to the bike industry?
It doesn't have to be. You can have a biking or non-biking one.
Okay. It would be with a guy named Ken Hill. Does Ken Hill coaching? He teaches car racing and motorcycle racing. He raced at a high level, and his style allows. I think it crosses over to everything: motorcycles, bikes. I could spend a weekend with him and letting him give me the tips. Boy, I'd sure sign up in a minute.
Yeah, and you've been getting quite into your motorbike racing, right?
Yeah, racing some off-road, quite a bit of off-road, cross-country style. Also, it's called NGPC, which is a blend of motocross and off-road. Still jumps, and I really like that style because I don't like 8-minute motos. I'd prefer to go a little longer. So for those mistakes, which is probably why I sucked at downhill, because too many mistakes in 3 minutes.
Love it. All right, last one. What's something you do every day that you feel benefits you?
Go for a walk after dinner.
Okay, every day?
Yep, every day.
And is that like a meditative time for you? How do you use that? What are you doing with your brain while you're on that walk?
Yeah, it's you're digesting your food and kind of just taking in the day, reflecting on the day, thinking about the next day, trying to keep it, trying to just keep anxiety to a medium of how things are going, and I use it as an opportunity to practice observing as well, which is a big part of it. Just not talking to anybody, just observing what's happening around. I like to use that term quite a bit, observe without judgment. So I think 15 minutes after dinner works out great.
Nice. So is that always done alone? Is there like a dog that comes with you or anything?
Oh yeah, the dog always comes. and can sometimes be a distraction. It could be a learning of the observations or a distraction, but the dog always comes.
Love it. Good stuff, man. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure hearing about what you've been up to. I'm sure there's more exciting stuff to come as well. If people want to follow you, like, where's the best place for them to be looking? Obviously, there's LinkedIn, I guess, for the pro tip stuff, but are there any other spots you'd want to send people to?
I try to stay active on Facebook and Instagram. A little bit less lately, more and more with all the stuff going on. So probably LinkedIn's probably the best.
Okay, good stuff. I'll stick a link to that in the show notes. People can find it. But yeah, thanks, Mark. Really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and share some stories from throughout the years. Yeah,
absolutely. It's a pleasure, Chris. And stoked to listen to your podcast while we're driving on the road for hours. Keeps the mind busy. And thank you.